desde Michoacán. Aparte, él había sido policía.
Ajá.
O sea, ya tenía el conocimiento de cómo funciona el sistema y la corrupción en México.
President Trump's war on drug trafficking getting even larger in scale, the president declaring cartels as unlawful combatants, paving the way.
What happens when the most elusive figure in Mexico's underworld faces justice, not with bravado, but with tears? The night of October 7th, 2025, rewrote history as federal agents closed in on San Pedro's docks, ending a decade-long manhunt for El Mencho, the crown prince of the CJNG. Now, for the first time, new footage reveals a moment few thought possible, the cartel kingpin breaking down as his sentence is handed down. This video exposes the unfiltered aftermath of the legendary raid, capturing the human side of a man known only by myth and fear. From the electrifying standoff in Los Angeles Harbor to the reactions echoing through two nations, the streets buzz with questions. How did the fall of El Mencho redefine the rules of international justice? What stories were buried amid the chaos? Get ready as we reveal the raw emotion, the behind-the-scenes drama, and the untold truth behind the tears that marked the end of an empire. New footage arrives from a tightly controlled facility, where lengthy investigations have kept the whispers of a gangland empire under careful watch. What unfolds on screen is not a spectacle of bravado, but a moment of restraint cracking under the weight of years spent in conflict with the state. The man known to the world as El Mencho sits in a sparse room, the camera capturing more than a face. It records a threshold crossing. The air seems still, the walls bare, and the only sound is the measured rhythm of a breathing pattern that suggests fatigue, calculation, and a plea to be heard. The footage centers on a posture rarely seen in public. The leader of a sprawling cartel appears small, almost overwhelmed by the legal verdict that now defines the horizon of his life. The life sentence looms, not as a distant abstraction, but as a concrete cage of time, with the numbers etched in an official document that critics say will outlast the man's last breath. In the frame, his eyes glisten, and the first tremor travels across the bridge of his nose before the cheeks betray a voice that has long managed to remain unreadable. Tears trace narrow paths, and for a moment they seem to carry the weight of years of violence, money, and bloodshed, as if the act of crying could rewrite the ledger of what has occurred. Observers might search for symbolism, the hand that cups a face, the steadying breath after a moment of quiet, the way the room absorbs the emotion rather than amplifying it. The scene is interrupted only by the soft click of a door latch and the distant murmur of officials outside. Yet the camera lingers on the man, letting silence do the heavy lifting. The tears are not a confession, but an admission that the chapter closed by the verdict is broader than personal grievance. It touches families, communities, and generations shaped by fear and violence. This is not a film of sensational moments, but a record of accountability in a system that has pursued sophisticated networks for years. The life sentence signals a break in the pattern that allowed a cartel to grow through fear, bribery, and the displacement of rivals. The emotional release captured here does not absolve past actions, but it does humanize a figure often reduced to headlines. Behind the courtroom prose, there is a person confronting the long arc of consequences, a moment where imagined power yields to the reality of confinement. As the footage continues, questions emerge about what comes next. The man in frame remains alive to the implications, both personal and strategic, for an organization that, for years, thrived on a narrative of invulnerability. Outside, supporters and opponents alike weigh the symbolic weight of a life sentence, a verdict that could recast alliances within illicit networks and alter the balance of influence across regions. The recording preserves a moment when a voice that once spoke in decisive tones faltered, and in that faltering, a broader story begins to unfold. The story of a throne relinquished not by treachery, but by time and law. As the frame lingers on the subject's hands, the texture of the moment becomes a study in restraint. A guard's silhouette moves in the background, not to intrude, but to remind the viewer that every second of vulnerability is measured against the larger machinery of detention. In the broader spectrum of headlines, this image sits beside reports of indictments, seizures, and international cooperation that mapped routes of illicit commerce. The emotional beat may surprise some viewers, yet it aligns with the tradition. To track power not by triumph, but by the fragile human lines that appear when the ground shifts beneath a life built on secrecy. The gang structure was intricate. It was divided into 6 distinct subsets, each with its own territory, its own set of responsibilities, yet all answered to a single, unseen spine that threaded the entire operation together. An intelligence network that moved in whispers and signatures, never in the open. North Quarter controlled street-level distribution and muscle. East Docks managed shipments that the world couldn't see. West End safeguarded cash flows and money laundering channels. South Ridge ran the enforcers who kept rivals in check with a signature brand of fear. Central Market held the logistics, warehouses, fake ledgers, and the seamless handoffs that turned raw product into a commoditized stream. Harbor Gate was the outward face, the liaison to corrupt officials, the front that let the operation breathe in daylight while still existing in the shadows. Behind the visible chaos of the raid lay a lattice of back-channel signals, a choreography learned over decades. Surveillance tapes had caught a pattern. 6 men rotating through each district on a rigid, almost ritual cadence. Never in the same place twice in a single week, but always in the same sequence, always returning to the spine.
Mulder, X-Files territory.
Yeah.
I think their main focus has always been to gain control of a large segment of that border fence. New Generation Cartel, as of now, doesn't really have a direct control over it.
The crown prince of the operation, believed to be El Mencho's most trusted proxy in this theater, had built his authority by translating fear into a disciplined obedience that felt almost corporate. The FBI and LAPD task force mapped that discipline in minute detail. A code in the way cash flowed, a cadence in the way shipments moved, a language of nods and gestures that no civilian would ever decode. Operation Wipeout unfolded with surgical restraint, even as the night around the docks roared with the cadence of rotors and the glint of searchlights. Dawn's pale blush hadn't broken the horizon when the perimeter went live, an airtight ring that left no room for improvisation. The first breach was tactical theater, a silent approach on a warehouse compound that stored everything from precursor chemicals to portable vaults of cash. Drones hummed above, cameras blinked to life, and a line of armored vehicles rolled into position as if rehearsed for a play only the guests could see. Inside, the air smelled of diesel and damp concrete, of crates stacked to the ceiling, and ledgers lined with numbers that looked like fingerprints. Each entry a trace of a transaction that stretched beyond San Pedro's borders. As teams swept through the 6 sub-districts, a chorus of quiet voices moved through the comms, 2-word confirmations, a handful of codes that translated into clear, hold, or containment. The 6 subsets in their carefully carved territories offered up a cascade of arrests. Lieutenants who wielded the day-to-day violence, money couriers who understood the geography of shell companies better than any map, and a cadre of mid-level operators whose duties chained them to the spine and kept the machinery humming even when faces changed. In one warehouse, officers found a bank of desktops with encrypted drives, their screens looping a never-ending ledger that linked street sales to offshore accounts in the blink of a cursor. In another, a shipment manifest exposed a corridor of supply so interwoven with legitimate commerce that the operation began to resemble a multinational enterprise rather than a street gang. And then there was the moment that made the operation feel like a hinge in history. A courier, dressed as a dock worker, attempted to vanish into a maze of containers, but was detained just as a data drive, small enough to fit in a palm, heavy with the weight of what it might reveal, was discovered in his jacket's lining. The drive pulsed with a map of financial arteries, a web of front companies, intermediaries, and trust structures that threaded through San Pedro, Los Angeles, and across the border into Mexico. The 6 subsets didn't just answer to a leader, they fed a pipeline that depended on this sort of archival evidence. Precisely this kind of digital breadcrumb trail to keep the house of cards standing. Amid the arrests, there was a figure whose presence felt almost ceremonial in the underworld, the banker, a name whispered for years in safe houses and back rooms where menus of influence were passed around like counterfeit coins. He was said to be the man who could move money the way a conductor moves a baton, turning risk into liquid assets and risk into silence. The charges that began to stack against him were more than typical narcotics offenses. They were a ledger of complicity, a record of how the CJNG network existed not only in the violence of the present, but in the quiet arithmetic of global finance. By dawn, the first edifice of the case stood up in the glare of the morning's first lights. Counts of conspiracy, racketeering, money laundering, and a constellation of trafficking charges that would creep toward extradition and international cooperation the moment the dust settled. Outside the warehouses, the world reacted in real time. News crews gathered near the harbor, their cameras catching the hush that followed the initial thunder of the raid, the slow exhale after a long night of chases and alarms. Street corners filled with whispers, some voices buoyed by relief, others by fear. Relief that the city's veins were once again being pried open from the outside. Fear that the root systems of corruption might prove more tenacious than any single raid could sever. Officials spoke in guarded terms about a watershed moment and the plugging of critical arteries, language designed to reassure without promising miracle cures. The international ripple effects were immediate. Extradition requests drafted, offshore probes broadened, and a flurry of financial investigators tracing every wire and every contract that could possibly connect back to the operation's core. What the night did, more than anything, was test the architecture of cooperation. The Los Angeles harbor became a node in a larger map, one that stretched from the far reaches of the Pacific to the high courtrooms of Mexico. The Joint Task Force learned, again, how thin the line could be between legitimate commerce and illicit commerce when money moves with the same velocity as product, and how fragile craft can be when a single data drive or a single ledger page can collapse a kingdom built on fear. The chase would now move from the street corner into courtroom corridors and into the labyrinth of international law, where every arrest becomes a lead and every asset seizure becomes leverage for further inquiries. Yet for all the precise planning, the night carried a pulse of uncertainty. The arrest of individuals tied to El Mencho's inner circle did not mean the end of the empire, far from it. The network, like any living organism, would adapt, reform, rebrand, and survive by recalibrating its supply chains, its money trails, and its alliances.
Sinaloa Cartel Federation now has an element within it that has allied themselves with his cartel.
Investigators understood that the real work would come in weeks and months as asset forfeitures hardened, indictments accrued, and new lines of inquiry were drawn through the remains of the data drives and the complex web of shell companies. The battle would not be won in a single raid. It would be won in 1,000 micro-wars fought across corridors of power. As the first strands of dawn began to creep across the harbor, a quiet certainty settled over the investigators on the ground. This was a turning point, not a terminal point. The arrest had peeled back a layer of the cartel's facade, but the true revelation would be the work that followed, the questions that would define the next chapter. Who stood behind the throne? How deep the loyalty networks ran? And what new orders would govern the underworld's geography in a world where justice travels at the speed of a helicopter and a hard drive? What followed would require patient, relentless inquiry, a pursuit that would thread through warehouses, courtrooms, and back rooms in both countries, gathering fragments of truth until a coherent map emerged. And as the harbor woke to a city that would never be the same, the narrative pressed forward, inviting the next chapter to begin its own descent into the tangled beneath. A descent that would reveal not just who wielded power, but how power itself moves when the light finally touches the darkest corners. The night that began with engines and searchlights now settles into a rhythm of testimony and inquiry, and the stage is set for the deeper questions to take center stage. Across the water, the echoes of the raid begin to settle into a longer arc, the quiet before the next storm. And so, with the evidence cataloged and the networks mapped, the story slides into the hands of investigators and prosecutors who will chase the truth through a maze of people, accounts, and loyalties that refuse to stay buried. The next part will pick up there, tracing the threads from the docks to the courtrooms and beyond, into the unseen corridors where power negotiates its most consequential deals. That prison-born current ran deeper than any single block, threading through the city's fabric with a patient, almost clinical efficiency. The realization that the gang had been operating as a formal arm of a broader syndicate did more than redraw the map of responsibility. It reframed the very idea of threat. No longer a street-level fear, it became a problem of systems. Money flowing through coded channels. Orders passing along through a chain of risk and leverage. Enforcement teeth sharpened by the hush of numbers and numbers of numbers. In the weeks after the raid, the investigative machine did what investigative machines do when fed with time and a stubborn insistence on facts. It produced a dossier that read like a ledger of power. The search warrants yielded more than gun calibers and drug bags. They uncovered a disciplined economy. Piles of cash counted and recounted, ledgers hidden in safes behind false walls, and a pattern of payments that mapped onto legitimate-looking businesses as if the whole operation dressed in a borrowed suit. The money, experts testified, did not merely circulate. It lubricated the gears of a hierarchy that spanned neighborhoods, county lines, and enterprise fronts that never slept. The gang's upper tier became the focus, the shot callers who set the tempo and the enforcers who carried it out. But power, as investigators learned, does not stay upstairs when the roof leaks. Commands trickled down through a network of trusted associates, through mid-level managers who kept the street accounts, and through a revolving door of midwives for the enterprise. Trusted lieutenants who translated macro directives into micro actions, from the allocation of tasks to the discipline for those who veered off the script. The spokes of the wheel turned in a rhythm that no one outside the circle could mistake. Tax collection, distribution of narcotics, strategic violence to remind rivals and tenants of the gang's ever-present reach. And then there were the human stories, the people who wore loyalty like armor and carried fear like a second skin. Some had joined for protection, some for payoff, some because the alternative had nothing to offer but silence. For many families in Rancho San Pedro and surrounding neighborhoods, the raids meant a pause in the daily pressure to pay, or at least a momentary belief that the weight could be lifted. For others, it meant a fracture. The fear that what protected them yesterday could be the source of danger tomorrow. Investigators. New footage arrives from a high-security facility, arriving with a quiet crackle that betrays the age of the recording. The subject sits within a spare cell, the walls flat and unyielding, the air filled with a constant, distant hum. In the unflinching glare of fluorescent light, the man whose name has filled headlines for years takes on a posture that is at once stern and suddenly unsettled. The camera lingers on a moment when muscle tightens along the jaw, then loosens into a tremor that travels to damp eyes. Tears well, spill, and slide down weathered skin, leaving a trace of human fatigue in their wake. Behind the iron bars, the life sentence presses in, not merely as a legal verdict, but as a final threshold between a career of control and a long descent into confinement. A folded document rests in his hands, the edges worn, the text blurred by time or perhaps by the weight of what is written. He reads in silence, and the room seems to shrink as if the walls themselves sense the consequences of this revelation. The stillness is punctured by the distant, deliberate click of a lock, an audible reminder of a justice system that cannot hurry nor swayed by emotion. Observers describe the moment as a stark counterpoint to the public image long cultivated by those who followed his leadership. Here is a figure who once commanded networks across cities and markets, whose voice carried through whispers and cameras alike. The tears reveal a different script, one where fear, fatigue, and the burden of years spent eluding capture press on the present.
Okay, so Mencho's alive. They almost, like, there's no question now. Like, the motherfucker's alive and he's...
The scene hints at a human vulnerability that empire building tends to mask. A vulnerability hardened by routine surveillance, constant risk, and an 18-wheeler's worth of secrets kept in the dark. Investigators caution that a single frame cannot rewrite a history of violence or pivot the direction of a sprawling organization. Yet they argue the footage offers a window into the psychological cost of a life lived in the orbit of illicit power. A man who once dictated orders now negotiates the reality of a sentence that binds him to years of isolation. In the grain of the image, the human is visible beneath the legend, an individual who has been protected and who now confronts the frontier of protection gone, replaced by a fixed, impersonal future. For families and communities touched by his decisions, the moment carries a dense resonance. Some see it as a reminder that justice can reach even the most entrenched figures, while others wonder if remorse is more a strategic posture than a genuine turning point. The footage does not erase harm or rewrite history. It reframes it, inviting questions about accountability, restitution, and the continued vulnerability of those exposed to the cartel's reach. It also invites reflection on the risks faced by those who continue to operate within or against a system designed to outlast individual lives. The image travels beyond the cell to the corridors of policymakers and law enforcement, where the emotional texture of captivity feeds into strategic assessments. It forces a renewed look at the structure of the organization, the loyalties that hold it together, and the fault lines that might still be exploited by investigators and prosecutors alike. In this moment, the human cost becomes a hinge for conversations about deterrence, resilience, and the limits of punishment in denying power. As the frame fades, the scene leaves a clear directive for what comes next. The pursuit of evidence, the weighing of testimonies, and the ongoing scrutiny of the network that extended far beyond the man in the cell. The next phase will explore how such intimate glimpses recalibrate the balance between spectacle and substance, and what they reveal about the landscape of crime, punishment, and survival in the years ahead. The story continues, and the camera returns to follow the threads that connect this personal moment to the broader investigation, the courtroom, and the communities watching from afar. The city holds its breath as the frame shifts from the crackle of intercepts to the quiet clang of courtroom doors. The raid may have cleaved the surface, but the deeper currents, the money trails, the loyalties, the hidden records remain. Investigators begin to map not just who fell, but how a network so sprawling could be kept alive by ships that never slept, by fronts that wore ordinary faces, by a language of codes that slipped through the cracks of legitimate business. In the courtroom, the room hums with a different intensity. Walls white as a ledger, shadows cast by the weight of documents stacked like small cliff faces. Prosecutors lay out financial spreadsheets, shipping manifests, and a chain of custody that stretches across states and borders. A courier's encrypted messages, once a secret handshake, become exhibits, each line a thread linking dock workers, freight forwarders, and financiers to a broader transnational machine. The defense questions the fragility of evidence, the reliability of informants, the possibility of misinterpretation in the translation of jargon and jargon-rich jokes that traveled in coded form. The judge, not as a gatekeeper of gossip, but as a referee of proof, weighs the value of a single ledger entry against the glare of a media spotlight that loves drama more than nuance. Meanwhile, the investigators understand a harsher truth. The collapse of a single faction does not cleanse the city of danger. It shifts the configuration of power. The cartel's lifelines, its ports, its corrugated supply routes, its brokers who balance risk with cash, are not severed by a single raid. They are rethreaded, rebalanced, reimagined in a city that learns quickly how to survive the ruptures of violence. New leaders emerge in the shadows of the old. The quiet supervisors of sales and shipments who never touched the gun but kept the machinery turning. The story refuses to reduce to a single emblem: the man in the cell, the prosecutor's slide, the thunder of a raid. It expands, becomes a map of dependencies. The intimate glimpses, the private conversations captured on the edge of a night patrol, the hurried phone calls when a shipment hit a snag, the memory of a family torn apart by a knock on the door, start to recalibrate how the public understands crime, punishment, and survival. Spectacle remains: the flashing cameras, the dramatic charges, the headlines that travel faster than a rumor can run. But substance asserts itself in the margins. The ways communities organize when fear is measured in small acts of mutual aid. The neighbors who keep watch over one another. The advocates who push for accountability beyond sensational verdicts. The story also grows beyond the city's waterfront. The CJNG's reach, its ability to pivot, selling not just fentanyl and meth, but shaping other illicit economies, has forced law enforcement to think in corridors and ports rather than merely streets. International cooperation becomes a character in its own right. Data sharing pacts, joint investigations, extradition requests, the choreography of arrests that must cross languages and legal systems as easily as the drug shipments crossed borders once. In this larger frame, the fight is not only against a cartel boss, but against the latticework of corruption and complicity that stretches through legitimate commerce and bureaucratic inertia alike.